There's been a lot of talk about diversity here this weekend, and I like it. I'm glad somebody said, you know, we didn't get an old man here, so that's good, Gardner. You know, there are a lot of things that impact me when I come here to Brooklyn, and I was just thinking today as I came into the city, one thing that gets me is just the tons and tons of people. This apartment block after apartment block. I think it hits me more in Brooklyn than it does in any of the other boroughs. It goes all the way from, what is it, the Queensboro Bridge, I think it says Queens, but all the way to Far Rockaway. And they call it Far Rockaway for a reason. When I think of so many people here, I am so thankful for this little band of disciples. It's holding forth here with its light in the community. I'm glad you're here. And may God bless you all and keep on blessing you all to be alive in this area. You know, we tend to focus in all aspects of life on the stars, the big movers and the shakers. You know, a few months ago, if you'd asked me, name 3 Brooklyn Nets, that's going to be easy, you know. You got Kyle Irving, you got Harden, you got Kevin Durant. But if you ask me now, name 3 Brooklyn Nets, I do like Dimwitty. But it would be hard for me to name anybody else. Sometimes we're that way in the Bible, aren't we? I know when I was growing up, they said, you divide Acts into 2 portions. Chapter 1 through 12, the Acts of Peter. And then chapter 13 through 28, the Acts of Paul. Well, there's your big stars. There's just a whole lot more people there and a whole lot more going on than what you see with Peter and Paul. I like this topic I was giving, Unsung Heroes in the book of Acts. The main problem, picking someone out from so many that I could choose. And I think of Dorcas and Lydia and Timothy and Silas. I saw a good article one time about the unnamed men from Cyprus. Anybody here know what the unnamed men from Cyprus did? They were the first ones to see that the Gentiles were receiving the gospel from Peter, and they went to Antioch and began to preach there. Don't know their names, but they were some unsung heroes. But I've chosen 4 for the lesson this afternoon. And the last 2 are 2 for the price of 1. You'll see what I mean when I get there. I'm going to start off playing a little game like I teach the little kids class on Saturday night at Fairlawn. I told them we got a substitute for tonight, so I don't have to rush out of here. I'm not saying you all are little kids, but I want to play the game a little bit. The more hints I give, the more of you should get who I'm going to be talking about. By the end, you should know. Everybody should know. First of all, he was probably a Gentile. He was probably from Troas. There are a few argue these points a little bit, but it looks like that's the way it was. He was one of the most faithful companions of the Apostle Paul. Start maybe zeroing in a little bit. This may zero in a little. He was probably with him when he died. At least he was one of the last ones with Paul before he died. I can see lights coming on here and there. He wrote more than a quarter of the New Testament. More lights coming on. According to the book I said, I did not count this up on my own. 27.5% of the New Testament was written by him. And of course, now you know I'm talking about Luke. We wouldn't have the book of Acts if it weren't for Luke. And I wanted to talk about him first. You don't hear a lot about Luke when you talk about famous people in the Bible. And yet, if it weren't for him, we wouldn't have these treasures. Luke and Acts. The Lord used him to give us these treasures. They're the books in the New Testament that are given over most to historical detail and geographical detail. I'm a map nerd. I don't know if anybody else here is a map nerd. I love Google Maps. I love it. I think Luke would have liked Google Maps. He is very focused on geography. He's very focused on history. I used to have maps all over my office when we first moved out to Northwest New Jersey. Emily, slight chance you might remember them. Just USPS maps. That was my wallpaper. Luke would have liked that, I think. But we can see in Luke a carefulness, a caution, a precision in talking about history and geography that belies that lie about the Bible that so many ignorant people say, the Bible is just a bunch of fairy tales. Read Luke and Acts and change your mind. A few of you may know Glenn Jones, who's preached for many, many years in Germany. You may know Germany is a very skeptical country. Very few people believe in Christ in Germany. And his tactic in reaching the Germans is to talk with them and say, I teach the Bible. And sometimes they will politely, Germans usually very polite, say, well, we don't believe in that. I respect you, but I don't believe in the Bible and God. And he'll give them a little challenge. Do you really think you need to judge the Bible without reading it? And sometimes they have a sense of fair play. Why don't you just take a few weeks and read the books of Luke and Acts with me? And a number accept. And he says when they get through reading the books of Luke and Acts, not all of them, of course, become Christians, but he says this, all of them respect. They've gained respect for the Scriptures because of Luke's style that God used to tell us the story of Jesus and to tell us about the extension of the church. Luke was a doctor, and you can see little hints of this all through his writing. He used medical terminology in describing the illness of the father Publius, if you remember that from Acts chapter 28. He said that he literally had attacks of gastric fever. I don't think most of us would use that term, but that's a common term used in the Greek language, evidently. He shows a great deal of interest in some things that kind of gross us out. Judas falling headlong, and just to be PG-13 here a little bit, and all his bowels gushing out. Luke was kind of interested in that. And it was mentioned earlier. How did Herod die? If you can take it, you remember it was not a very pretty death, but Luke kind of interested in what was going on with these enemies of Christ. Look what happens to them. We sometimes tend to think of ancient doctors as being something like witch doctors, and of course in primitive eras you had that, but from some articles I read, many were quite competent, using herbs and other remedies that we realize today would have had a good effect on many diseases. So he was not a witch doctor. He was a physician whose skills would have been appreciated. He knew legitimate cures. And of course what most interests us about Luke are spiritual lessons that we can gain from him and what he did. I was going to talk briefly about two. He used his skills to serve God. I already talked about his writing skills. Evidently a very eloquent Greek that indicates a high level of formal education. He used his medical skills to help the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul evidently had problems with his eyes, and I'm not sure if that's what he's talking about when he mentions his thorn in the flesh. But he had some physical problems that were painful to him. And the older he got, the more he seemed to have them. I know something about that. But what a blessing to have someone like Luke along with him. And in chapter 27, when evidently he was allowed to take some companions, who did he choose? Aristarchus and, of course, our friend Luke. It must have been great to have a personal doctor. Our president has a personal doctor. Elvis had a personal doctor. Michael Jackson had a personal doctor. But seriously, just to have someone who can take care of your every need that you might have. Well, how did he have time to do that? If he had some kind of a personal practice, he must have been willing to leave it. What's necessary to be a disciple? To leave everything. The fishermen who followed Jesus left those nets, left those fish. They left everything to follow Jesus. Evidently, Luke was willing to do that at least for years at a time so that he could serve the Apostle Paul. And you know what happens when you serve godly people, who are you really serving? You're serving God. So he was willing to sacrifice. But if you have your Bibles, turn to 2 Timothy chapter 4. This chapter is one of the saddest chapters to me in the Bible, and at the same time, one of the most triumphant. You get that mixture of tragedy and triumphant. Paul is about to die. And when he needs friends the most, they're jumping ship. They're leaving him. And here are some of the sad verses. 2 Timothy 4, let's start with verse 9. Timothy, make every effort to come to me soon. Here's the sad verse. For Demas, having loved this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia. Titus to Dalmatia. Now, two of these people we know were close associates of Paul in the past, especially Demas, mentioned positively in Colossians, and Philemon, a companion of Paul, who went with him, who was along with him in many of his battles, and yet when Paul most needs him, when he most needs a loyal friend, as they say in South America, ciao, he's out of there. This is no good for me. He loved the present world. It doesn't say here why Titus left. I hope he had a good excuse, but what excuse could there be for abandoning this man of God in his moment of greatest need? It's tragic. But what does the first part of verse 11 say? Only Luke is with me. All are abandoning him. There's this one faithful man of God. Only Luke is with me. That's an uncomfortable situation. He's on death row. He's about to die. Christians aren't being looked upon with favor. None of that stuff moved this loyal man of God, Luke. I am staying here with him until the end. That's one of the best lessons we can learn from Luke. Unfailing, unfaltering dedication to Jesus Christ, and by extension, that same type of dedication to his people. That's a powerful lesson that we get from an unsung hero in the book of Acts. But let's go on to the second one. I'm not going to play any games with you on this one, but turn to Acts chapter 16. Let's talk about Lydia. We read verses 13 through 15, and we find out several things about her here. Paul and his companions arrive in Europe to the city of Philippi. And verse 16 says, a woman named Lydia from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple fabrics, a worshiper of God, was listening. And the Lord opened her heart to respond to the things spoken by Paul. And when she and her household had been baptized, she urged to say, if you have judged me to be faithful in the Lord, come into my house and stay. And she prevailed upon us. There's a little group of women that would have met in the river that flows through Philippi on Sabbath day to worship God. Paul and his companions come across her. So what are some things we can see about her in these verses? First of all, she was a seller of purple. We're talking about a very expensive ink that was used only on the most expensive clothes. And this, together with the fact that she obviously had a house capable of keeping guests, indicates she was probably a wealthy woman. It also says she's from the city of Thyatira. This was the place known for its ink industry. It says that she worshiped God. This phrase indicates that she was what we sometimes call a proselyte, someone who was seeking God even though a Gentile, and perhaps even been converted to Judaism. This shows that she had a good heart. God wanted her to hear the gospel. And it's interesting when you read the text that comes before this, it looks like God's just maneuvering the situation so that Paul and his companions will arrive right there at that time. after leaving Antioch in Pisidia, Paul and his companions evidently wanted to go to Asia. I had my map that Luke and I would both like. I can show you this. No, the Holy Spirit said, not Asia. Well, let's go up here to Bithynia. God said no. There was only one way to go. That was due west. It brought them out to a place called Troas, perhaps the hometown of Luke. And there in Troas, Paul has a vision. A man from Macedonia saying, "Come over and help us." Paul realized that was God telling them to go to Macedonia. He did not want them preaching in Bithynia at that time. He did not want them preaching in Asia at that time. Later, yes, but not at this time. Why Macedonia? What did he have in mind for them? You can almost imagine as Paul and his companion Silas, Luke's with him now. We'll get a lot of detail in this because Luke is with him. They come upon this little group of women by the side of the Crinades River. It almost looks like a creek if you see pictures of it. Might they have thought, is this why God didn't want us to go to Asia? Is this why he did not want us to go to Bithynia? There and among that group of women was someone special. They were all special, but Lydia is mentioned in particular. Something interesting is said about her there in verse 14. It says that God opened her, that's the last part of 14, yes, that the Lord opened her heart to respond to the things spoken of by Paul. You can hear a lesson for hours and hours on this. Don't worry. I'm not going to do it. I'm watching my time. I think it's just a simple explanation. Often the simplest explanation, I think, is the best. God opened her heart just as he closed Pharaoh's heart. He did it through his words and through his deeds, revealed in the words. Here's the thing. The same words and the same deeds that harden a stubborn heart will open a soft, a tender heart. I think that's what's happening here. And we've seen it sometimes when we take the word and read it to other people. What a great privilege it is to go and read the Bible with those who've never read it before. And sometimes I'll go and read, but as I'm reading, you can just sense the more I read, the less interested they are. I know I'm not the world's greatest reader, funny accent, all that stuff, but they're just kind of, starting to look at their watch when this guy's got to shut up. Since I know to be quiet and sit down. Now, don't get your hopes up for me doing that in the sermon now. But that happens sometimes. What's happening? What am I seeing? What am I observing? I think I'm observing somebody's heart being hardened. They have no interest. The more I read, the less interested they are. But on the other hand, isn't it great? Sometimes if somebody says, yeah, I'll read with you, and you can sense maybe at the first there's a little bit of reticence. They're not so sure about the situation. And yet the more you read the words, you can sense them opening up and a smile coming into their heart. The light goes on. They begin to ask questions. What's happening? I think God's opening their heart. They had a tender heart. They had a good and honest heart, to use the language of the parable of the sower, and it's doing its work. That's what's happening to Lydia. God opened her heart because she had the tender, open heart to hear the gospel. She obeyed the gospel. She was baptized into Christ. And another thing we learn about here in verse 15, and I like this part. The last part of 15. If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come into my house and stay. I don't think that was a suggestion. Look at the last verse here. And she prevailed on us. I like the word in Spanish in the traditional version. She obligated us. That's what it says in the Reina Valera. In other words, no more tents for you. You might even say today, in today's language, no more Motel 6 for you. You're staying in my house. She wanted to serve. She was a giver, not a taker. And as you read later on about the church in Philippi, they were the most generous church at all in contributing to Paul and his needs. Now, I have no direct evidence of this, but I, just by implication, know this. I imagine Lydia was behind a lot of that. Hey, folks, have we sent anything to Paul lately? Hey, let's take up a collection for Paul. She was concerned with helping others and let other people do that. So we've talked about Luke, we've talked about Lydia, and I'm going to talk about somebody else now. Some names go together. You can play this. Romeo and Juliet. Anthony and Cleopatra. And sometimes it's not very good. Samson and Delilah. This is the worst one of all, probably. Ahab and Jezebel. Sometimes it's good, though. Adam and Eve. Mary and Joseph. And of course, since we're in Acts, some of you probably know where we're going with this. Let's talk about Priscilla and Aquila. I want us to read some New Testament texts that talk about them and see why, though they're unsung people often, they're unsung heroes in the book of Acts. The Apostle Paul was in a very tough situation when he arrived in Corinth. He'd been run out of town in the cities of Macedonia, Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea. They made fun of him in Athens. And from there, he was so concerned about those new brethren in Thessalonica that he sent back Timothy to take care of them, to check on them. So he comes by himself into Macedonia. He has no friends. He just has the Lord. As he said on various occasions, that was enough. At the same time, he said in 1 Thessalonians 3:7, describing his emotional state when he came to Corinth, he said he was in affliction and distress. You know, sometimes we think of the Apostle Paul as some kind of an automaton. You push the button and he goes, preaches, and it's just, he was a man just like us, with a lot of the challenges that we have. And when you read his letters, you can sense his emotional ups and his emotional downs. God encouraged him, but it just wasn't automatic necessarily. And when he came to Corinth all by himself, it was a downtime. But you know, sometimes when we're desperate, it's when God blesses us with friends who build us up and encourage us through those tough moments. And that's what happened in Corinth. Because when he comes there, here are two people, Aquila and Priscilla, who are going to build him up and who are going to be his friends, his close friends, for the rest of his life. Paul needed them. Paul needed them, and they needed him. We're not even sure if they were Christians when Paul met them. All it says, and let's just read that passage, Acts chapter 16. I'm sorry, chapter 18, verses 1 through 3. After these things, he left Athens and went to Corinth, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. He came to them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they were working, for by trade they were all tent makers. So we don't know for sure if they were Christians from that. All we know is that Aquila was a Jew from Pontus. Was Priscilla Jewish or not? Doesn't say. You might imply that she wasn't, since Paul's background is Aquila's background is mentioned and hers isn't. The text says they had to leave Rome because of an edict of Claudius. And we have a little reference in history to that. In the year 49, mentioned by Suetonius. But they were close to Paul the rest of his life. They helped him at the beginning of the congregation there at Corinth. And some people have said today, I think the lesson we just had by Brother Shaw, that brethren aren't always easy. There are challenges. They weren't easy at Corinth. There were challenges at Corinth. But I know who was by his side as he took these on. Aquila and Priscilla were by his side. And in all his battles, it seemed like they were constantly supporting him, consoling with him, and working with him. And in verses 18 and 19, when he left Corinth for Ephesus, they went with him. And they chose to stay in Ephesus while Paul went on to Judea. What's an application we can get from this? the importance of choosing good people as our friends and sticking with them. That's of great importance. That makes a tremendous difference in our life. I can imagine that Paul was somewhat older than them, maybe an eccentric old bachelor, if you hate to almost use that term, but that might have been the way that some people would have looked at him. And yet they saw in him someone who was completely dedicated to God. He could help them do the same thing. They could have gone on in their lives without Paul, but how many blessings would they have lost? They decided to help him, to stick with him, and what a blessing. I wonder how much to use personal illustrations. I think you all can take it. Who is someone in your life you've come across and just trying to set you on the right way? There was a young man I knew as a teenager who was kind of had a shallow outlook on the world. Everybody liked him, but he's kind of shallow. And somebody talked him into being baptized. But he said, at least he wanted to go to a college where there were Christians. And so he went. And somebody asked me, how do you think this is going to turn out? I said, it's going to turn out either very, very good or very, very bad. And at first, it looked like it was going to be the latter. He got in with all the worldly people and worldly friends, but he had something going for him. He knew a young lady named Emily, who told you I didn't want to get too personal, but she's here with us today. And she introduced him to another young man. Hey, you don't need to hang around with these, as Dominicans would call them, tiganes. You don't need them. Here's the kind of guy you need to hang out with, and the guy she wanted him to hang out with was a guy named Caleb. I think some of you all know him. But, of course, I'm talking about Roger. Sorry, Roger. It's a good illustration. Well, Roger was kind of fascinated by this Caleb fellow, always talking about the Bible, always talking about prayer. And so Caleb noticed that he was hanging around and said, hey, you need to read the Bible with me. Okay, I'll read the Bible with you. 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. I think it was 6 or something like that. What? But he did. He did. He started reading. And he found he liked the Scriptures. And, of course, now he's a fellow worker. And if you're here this morning, you hear the powerful testimony of the Scriptures that come from him. I think sometimes, and he's made this point, I'm kind of stealing this point from him. If he had not attached himself to Caleb, if he had not taken Emily's advice, and that of other kids, I would hate to think of what he would have become. And he says that himself. You talk to him. Who have you attached yourself to that's really helped you become closer to Christ and be like him? Hang out with that person. Be with them. Go on visits with them. Study with them. Pray with them. That'll make a big difference in your life. And you can also look at this negatively. And I usually talk about this especially when I talk with young people, young single people. If someone you run across, they may be handsome, their dad may have a lot of money, may have a sports car. If you run across someone that's not going to help you live eternally with Jesus Christ, get away from them. And that's, of course, especially true if you're talking boyfriend or girlfriend. I used to think this only applied to 18 to 22-year-olds. I've had some battles with some 40 and 50-year-olds who were determined to get in with somebody who would not help them. Look, he has no work, he has no spiritual interest, he has no desire to serve God. But I love him. Don't be that person. Don't be that person. Find someone who will help you go to heaven. And if they won't, you can find people here without a romantic interest as a single person who can help you go to heaven. Spend your time with spiritually minded, spiritually healthy people. Let's find some other things about Aquila and Priscilla that will help us. Turn to Acts chapter 18. Well, we're already there. What did I say? But here in verses 24 through 28, Paul goes on to Judea, and Aquila and Priscilla stay in Ephesus. And they go to the synagogue one day. That would have been their custom as Jewish people to attend the synagogue each Saturday. And what happens? Now, a Jew named Apollos, an Alexandrian by birth, an eloquent man, came to Ephesus, and he was mighty in the Scriptures. This man had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent of spirit, he was speaking and teaching accurately the things concerning Jesus. Let's stop right there. You can imagine Aquila and Priscilla. Okay, let's go to the synagogue. They go there, and they read portions of the law, as was their custom, and would anybody like to speak? And this fellow stands up. They've never seen him in their lives, but he begins speaking with fervor and eloquence. And he starts talking about Jesus. You can almost imagine Aquila. He's one of us. Listen to him talk about Jesus. They would have been thrilled. This guy's on our side. As they listen a little more, look at the last part of 25. Being acquainted only with the baptism of John. Here. Look at verse 26. And he began to speak out boldly in the synagogue. But when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. They were very tactful in their way of reaching him and in corrected him. Now, I think in doing this, we see two extremes that they avoid. One extreme would have been to say, just let this go. This is no big issue. You don't have to understand everything about baptism. Just let him go. They wanted him to know better. They wanted him to know about the baptism of Jesus Christ. So they avoided the other extreme as well, that of condemning him in public or being sarcastic or ugly with him. What, an ignorant guy who doesn't even know the right baptism? But they followed the teachings of 1 Timothy chapter 2, 24 and 25 by correcting him with gentleness. With gentleness. Now, some brethren have done a lot of harm by correcting others sarcastically, publicly, when it hasn't been necessary. When such tactics are simply not called for. What they need to do is follow the example of Priscilla and Aquila. This reflects well on Apollos as well. It says he was from Alexandria. He was an eloquent man. Being from Alexandria was kind of a feather in the cap. It'd be like saying, this fellow's from Oxford. This guy's from Cambridge. And we just would imply from that he probably had some study in those places. And yet, he allowed himself to be taught even by people who some people might have considered to be his social inferiors. And that's important if we're going to get to the truth. We're going to have to allow ourselves to be taught even by some that people of the world, I hope we wouldn't think this way, who we consider us to be social inferiors. I've got a pretty story. I think I've got time for it. I spent a long time talking with a man named Foy Short, who preached many years in southern Africa, in what's now Zimbabwe. But he told me something that happened before the country was Zimbabwe. The country was Rhodesia. It was governed by a very tiny white minority of people who aren't very kind or fair in their treatment of the Africans there. So we're talking late 1950s. And there was an Englishman named Neville, who was in charge. Of course, the Englishmen are almost always in charge of a railroad detail. But he noticed that as he was going among the workers, there was a young man there named Jeffrey Nyembezi, who was always at lunchtime, every time, he just had all the people, and he was teaching them the Bible. And so Mr. Neville stopped and listened to him on a few occasions. This guy knows the Bible. And he would just sit and listen himself to him. And finally, one day, he asked Jeffrey Nyembezi. Brother Short said this is something that never happened among the English in Rhodesia at that time. He invited Jeffrey Nyembezi to his house to teach him and his wife about the Bible. So, Jeffrey went, taught him the gospel. The Nevilles obeyed the gospel, became Christians. That's a good example. They were following the example of Apollos. The fact that Aquila and Priscilla were willing to teach Apollos, and he was willing to listen to them and be changed, gives a powerful result. You read about the influence of Apollos, especially in Corinth. He became a powerful force in the kingdom of God. But we can give some of that credit to Priscilla and Aquila. Incidentally, her name does come first there. We have a team without jealousy. That's another point I want to make. But turn to 1 Corinthians 16. It looks like when you read that Aquila and Priscilla kind of had a little circuit. Rome, Ephesus, Corinth. And, of course, those are important centers for the gospel. Paul wrote, and so you see several mentions of them. As Paul is writing in 1 Corinthians, he talks about them. Verse 19. And that's going to help me if I get there. 16, 19 instead of 15, 19. Okay. The churches of Asia greet you. Aquila and Priscilla greet you heartily in the Lord, with the church that is in their house. So they're in Ephesus now, and Aquila and Priscilla greets them. Now, you're going to have to be sharp to get this next thing, but I'll tell you. There's a couple of things here that are different from most references to them. One is that, whose name appears first here? Aquila. It's usually Priscilla. If I count right, this depends on the version. 6 times their names appear together in the scriptures. 4 times her name comes first. That's something you don't see a lot in the scriptures, and especially in that culture of that day and time. Well, why? A few people say maybe her family connections, but I have a feeling it was just she was probably a little more advanced in her understanding and her knowledge. Well, was Aquila jealous of her? Why'd you put her name first? I'm guy who wears the pants around here. No, there was no jealousy. They were a team. They were a team. When you want your team to win, you want the best on your team you can. I'm sure he was proud of his wife, Priscilla, as a team. I know a couple right now. I think I can say this safely without anybody identifying who I'm talking about. But she's more advanced in the Bible than he is. Good bit more advanced. And yet he preaches. And I just heard on the internet a few days ago him preaching. I thought, that's pretty good. And I thought, I think I know who wrote that sermon for him. That's okay. That's okay. If you're a team, you use each person's abilities or positions for the Lord's glory. And that's what this couple is doing that I'm mentioning now. That's what we see with Priscilla and Aquila. No place for jealousy in God's kingdom, either in the church or in the family. We're all a team. A couple of other things. Turn to Romans 6. Romans 16, 3 and 4. Now here's, evidently they're back in Rome, because Paul says, greet Prisca, that's not the diminutive form, the regular form. Greet Prisca and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus, who for my life risked their own necks, to whom not only do I give thanks, but also the churches of the Gentiles. One thing we find out about them here is that they risked their lives for Paul. Literally, this term means they exposed their neck, as it were, to the executioner. Now, how did that happen? I wish I knew. I don't know how that happened. The Bible doesn't say. People that like to speculate say maybe they gave Paul refuge when he was being chased by the authorities. But the question is, who would you be willing to risk your life for? I know our family members, our children, our spouse, good brother. Sometimes we have to risk things for Jesus Christ. I think particularly of social risk. if we are careful in following Christ, sometimes we're going to have to talk a little bit differently from everybody else. If we are going to serve Christ, sometimes we're going to have to dress a little differently from everybody else. And that might mean on occasions being looked upon as a bit of an oddball or a weirdo. And some Christians aren't strong enough for that. They just can't take it. What are you willing to risk for Christ? Romans 16, verse 5 also indicates that the church met in their house. Another text mentions that as well. Everything they had belonged to the Lord. If you have something, what good is it if you don't use it in the Lord's service? And that includes your house. That includes your apartment. But let's go to the final text I want to think about here, and that's 2 Timothy chapter 4. And we've already mentioned the context here. Paul's about to die, and he wrote Timothy, and he did not want to forget to mention his friends who were obviously back in Ephesus at that time. And so in verse 19, we have the last reference to them that we see in the Scriptures. Greet Prisca and Aquila and the household of Onesiphorus. Shortly after this, the Apostle Paul died, probably decapitated. When reading this passage in the context of Priscilla and Aquila, I ask myself, how would they have died? How would Priscilla and Aquila have died? Would one have died before the other? The other be left a widow or a widower? That happens so much. And I think we need, if we think about that, to serve our widows and our widowers. They need our help. But that's often the lot of many in life. And the older you get, believe me, the more you think about it. What's going to happen if one of us is left alone? Might they have died together? Maybe as martyrs. That would a nice thought in a way. But that's it. The more I think about this, the more I think, does it really matter how they died? Does it really matter how they died? What matters? How they lived. We can't choose how we're going to die. We think sometimes it would be cancer, it would be heart, some other things the doctors start to talk to me about. We can't choose that. But we can choose how we live. We can give our lives over to Jesus Christ. That's the only thing that makes any sense at all. I want to conclude by trying to sum up the principle that I think we see here. You know, we have a tendency sometimes to look at the stars, the 5 talent people. And if we're not careful, we start saying, I can't do like that guy. Sometimes I've seen preachers, little groups, and I think, I'll join in this conversation. So I go in and they're talking way over my head. I think these fellows have read a lot more than I have. They know what they're talking about. I have no idea. I still try to fake it sometimes. One fellow says, well, he's okay in his writing, but he's definitely wrong in his soterology. And I said, yeah, he is wrong in his soterology. They're wrong. Soterology. I think I'm so inferior. I can't read like those guys. I'm not smart enough to know all those things. No. One time, I heard this story, and these names won't mean a lot to you if you're a younger Christian, but if you're older, they might. My dad and a man named Aud McKee were listening to a man named Paul Earnhardt preach. And Paul Earnhardt is one of the most eloquent preachers I know. Just lays out the scriptures in ways you've never known. And Brother McKee leaned over and whispered to my dad, if what he's doing is called preaching, what's that you and I do, Paul? I felt that way a few times. You know, if what that guy does is called preaching, what's it that I do called? We don't have to be a star. We don't have to be a 5-talent man. We don't have to turn the world upside down to serve God and glorify Him. We don't have to be Paul or Peter. We don't even have to be Luke, Barnabas. We could be maybe Priscilla or Lydia or Dorcas. We can be those men from Cyprus who went and told the gospel to Gentiles, taking a proper concept of what happened in the house of Cornelius. So, may God help us to be satisfied with what we can do. Try to do more, but you understand what I'm saying. Be satisfied if we're a one-talent man or a two-talent man. That's where a lot of glory goes to God. We do what we can, and all of us receive the same reward. May God help us. Thank you.